competitive federalism.
And the Chinese premier, of course, on his part saying that he did not deny there were disagreements but need to keep up momentum on the process to resolve border disputes.
I don't deny there are disagreements between India and China, but we have more in common than our differences. We must keep up momentum on the process of border resolution. We need to jointly uphold peace and tranquility. India and China need to hold regular contact. Trade ties can be further enhanced between the two countries. We must increase trade volume.
So this is the press briefing hall, the Taiwan room as they call it here in Beijing, where just a few minutes ago we had Premier Li Keqiang and Prime Minister Modi addressing the press. Yes, on the big contentious issues there hasn't been much progress, but there have been 24 deals that have been signed, and it covers a wide gamut of areas from space cooperation to skill development to railways, infrastructure, sister city agreements, provincial agreements, and for the first time they're setting up a state and provincial leaders forum, which is, as the Prime Minister said, the first time that India is doing something like this with any country in the world. So I think 24 agreements was way over what anybody expected. What is more important is also the fact that they have shown commitment on some of the contentious issues, most notably the border. The Prime Minister once again reiterating the fact that he would like China to consider the reclarification of the LAC. That's a demand that he had made back in September as well when Xi Jinping visited. But I think there hasn't been much progress on that front. Once again, both sides stressing the primacy of the SR process, saying that is the mechanism to deal with the border, and that's a process that will take care of itself. Has there been any breakthrough on the border question in this visit? Certainly not. I think what's more important is I think both sides are certainly trying to play up the economic engagement, trying to say that look at the range, look at the depth as well as the breadth of the relationship in terms of the areas that we're cooperating in. These 24 agreements, I mean, our initial sense from when we spoke to the Chinese ambassador a week ago, he said that we're expecting about $10 billion worth of deals, but now we have 24 agreements, and I wouldn't be surprised if this tops that $10 billion figure. So I think the attempt has been to clearly play up the economic and trade part. We're also setting up a mechanism, incidentally, to address the specific concern that India has on the trade deficit. So that itself, that also is a novel thing that's come out of this visit. So all in all, I think successful as far as the economic and trade part is concerned. Still not much progress when it comes to the contentious issues. In Beijing, with cameras in Bharat Bhushan, this is Zakir Jacob for CNN IBN.
Let's get more on that story. We are now being joined by Mr. Sumant Sinha, CEO of ReNew Power, joining us from Gurgaon. Also joining us, Nitin Gokhale, Senior Fellow at the Vivekanand International Foundation. He's a strategic affairs analyst here, getting us the details. First to you, Mr. Sumant Sinha. You've been part of many of these talks as far as private sector is concerned. Are you satisfied looking at the 24 agreements that have been signed? But as far as trade deficit is concerned, we do have a long way to go.
Yeah, I don't think it's the issue of the number of agreements that have been signed as much as the substance and the content of those agreements. I think at a macro level, the biggest problem that India has clearly is our trade deficit with China. We import only $15 billion worth of goods to them, but we import about $50 billion or more. And even though China is our largest trading partner, we are really only 15th in their list. And therefore, we have to do something from our side to increase exports from India into China, while at the same time looking at the imports that we have of so many hundreds of items. I think the way this can be done is, if you try to do business in China, it's not that straightforward. There are lots of cultural barriers, there are lots of trade barriers. A lot of the private sector or a lot of the corporate sector in China is in the hands of the government, and they basically prefer to deal with other state-owned enterprises rather than really importing. Unfortunately, India is also not part of any global manufacturing supply chain, so it's not like we have an active engagement of import and export with China on that count. So there is a lot that we need to do in terms of opening and getting better market access into China. And I think that is an area that can be encouraged in multiple ways. I think one obviously is what the Prime Minister is trying to do, which is to push from his perch. The second thing, of course, is we can actually improve the amount of private sector involvement in China from India. And I think there is a lot of discussion that is meant to happen tomorrow between Indian private sector companies and Chinese companies in terms of signing agreements. So I think that really is going to be a very important aspect of this whole trip, to see what Indian businesses are able to make out of this whole trip. And the third thing is, I think we have to increase people-to-people contact between India and China. You know, for two such large and populous nations, we have a very small amount of traffic of people between the two countries. I was reading somewhere that it's about 800,000, every year. Out of it, 600,000 go from India and 200,000 come from China. So there's no people-to-people contact. There is no tourism. There is no cultural exchanges. And I think those are areas that we have to increase dramatically so as to get the two countries more comfortable with each other, and that will, I think, then lead to its own increase in trade automatically. And I think those are the areas that the government really needs to focus on a little bit more going forward, I think.
Right, certainly. So, in fact, some of those exchanges did exist, and I was lucky to be part of one which involved youth, and it really helped us understand what was going on there, meet people there. But, Mr. Gokhale, as far as trade disputes are concerned, you know, every meeting, whenever there's a high-level meeting like that, a lot of expectations are there. But when it comes down to really agreeing to something, there is nothing but a commitment.
Well, yes. In fact, that is the whole issue between India and China, that they have spoken about in taking the relationship to the next level, both in economic and trade aspects. But there are issues, there are non-tariff barriers in China, there are cultural issues, and there are, of course, the bureaucratic hassles, especially in India. The Chinese companies keep saying that the ease of doing business in India is extremely low, and therefore they find that to be a major obstacle. But, if you look at the overall aspect of the government-to-government agreements that have happened today, this morning in Beijing, one must look at the comprehensive nature in which this has been done. From space to yoga, and from cultural exchange and education exchange to railways and twin city concepts. And for the first time, a state and a province, Karnataka in India and the Sichuan province in China, would have a connect. That is what the governments have done, is they have taken doables and said, let's take incremental steps so that, we go forward inch by inch, rather than trying to achieve something that is impossible. For instance, the border. Right. Boundary issue is a very complex issue. It's been going on for the past 50 years and more, in fact 60 years. And therefore, it's not easy to jump from what I call managing the border, which India and China have done tremendously well in the past 3 decades. But it's one thing to manage the tensions on the border, and quite another to resolve the border issue, which is a very complex issue. So therefore, they have been very pragmatic and practical, and I think the Prime Minister, the Indian Prime Minister, has been very upfront in telling the Chinese that you need to adopt a different approach to the problems that exist, and therefore India expects China to have different approach. And by that, the unstated aspect of that statement is that China must not be too obdurate on the LAC, the line of actual control. And second, it must not keep on propping up Pakistan by giving it arms, nuclear weapons, and now a big investment in form of the economic corridor, $46 billion worth. So therefore, very upfront, and I think this is a new normal, as I call it, in India-China relationship, that they are not expecting breakthroughs in every visit. There will be more engagement at the highest level from the joint statement one can discern, and therefore, we'll have a new normal as far as the relationship is concerned.
Right, and they are talking straight. Mr. Sumant Sinha, you said that, sometimes, of course, it is well known that business is best done when companies or businessmen, corporate leaders come together and talk. And in the case of China, you said that it is difficult because most of the big corporations are run by the government itself. How easy or difficult will it be when the push comes from the Indian Prime Minister and on their side comes from their Premier?
No, I think it is an area where Indian businesses have to make a real effort. Because it's not as if companies from other parts of the world have not been operating in China for many years and have not been doing so successfully in many cases. I think Indian business people have traditionally shied away from China for 2 reasons. I think one, we've had a fairly big market domestically, and so therefore there has been always the effort to just capture market share in India. And I think the second reason has been the fact that we've as a set of corporates, we've been late to the party in China, frankly speaking. Many other companies have gone in there and have taken market share, and now for Indian companies to go in and take market share is not that straightforward.
Right.
And especially when you set that against cultural context and the ease of doing business on the Chinese side from an Indian perspective, that makes it harder. And so Indian corporates traditionally have said, why bother with this market when it's already late for us, and then we already have a domestic market. Now, I think that to some extent has to change, but it's not going to be that easy to change that, because we don't really have, as a corporate sector, the right set of competencies, certainly not on the manufacturing side. We're not cheaper than Chinese manufacturing, for example. So it's very hard for us to export stuff from here to there. And that's why most of our exports have been mostly around commodities and so on. We can, for example, companies like TCS and Infosys have set up service center, organizations in China to, sort of tap into that pool of labor there, which is, of course, no longer cheap. But it's not really been, not a lot of other Indian companies have gone in there and been successful. And I think this is something that Indian companies have to try harder at now, because, growth in China is not by any means stopped. It's still a huge market. It's 4 or 5 times the size of India. And even 5 or 7% growth in China leads to much more capacity addition in terms of new demand than higher growth in a smaller economy like India. So
Right.
we have to try to find ways of capture it.
Right, certainly. So we're just playing out some of the images that perhaps we will get sometime later when the Prime Minister reaches the Tsinghua University there. He's expected to make a public speech. We will come back to you, Mr. Sinha, for reactions after that speech. Also, taking a look now at the first controversy during the Prime Minister's China visit. State-run CCTV yesterday showed a map of India that excluded Arunachal Pradesh and Jammu and Kashmir altogether. The map was aired on China's national television broadcaster yesterday. It has triggered angry reactions on social media. The map was aired on CCTV soon after the Prime Minister landed in Xi'an yesterday. China's official maps also show Arunachal Pradesh as South Tibet and also exclude parts of Jammu and Kashmir. And getting us those reactions, it's Neha Punya. Over to you.